This majestic monument to George Washington is serving as a kind of tombstone tonight, measuring in its height the height of sorrow of Washington, the capital, for a fallen president. Even the bloodshot winking lights on its peak warning against airplanes themselves are symbolic of the sorrow and anger that Washington feels. People's official windows, the windows of official offices are still bright with lights. The government goes on, and indeed the shift of government officials from high to low is working under grief and under pressure for the transition that has already technically taken place to President Lyndon Johnson. About all that the people in Washington, and people, including the people here in the West Executive Wing of the White House, where Press Secretary Salinger has his office, and where the correspondents ordinarily assigned to cover the president have their offices right here. About all that people can do tonight, besides sorrow, is to reminisce over the times of when they first met this remarkable man who is now dead. Reminiscences, in a sense, are a kind of a cheap thing, and yet, inevitably, what is there else to talk about among friends and among strangers on a night like this? This correspondent remembers first meeting John F. Kennedy when he was running for the Senate against a man named Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts in 1952. By an ironic and unexpected twist of history, Cabot Lodge has been President Kennedy's ambassador in recent weeks of high emergency and tragedy and drama too to South Vietnam, and has been on his way home for other purposes. At that time, Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic candidate for President of the United States, and as a correspondent, I was covering Stevenson in Massachusetts when he came into the state to campaign with Kennedy. There was a certain coolness between the two politicians then, and there remained a certain coolness between them, but a great deal of mutual respect grew up over the years. After all, that was, incredibly enough, 11 years ago. Needless to say, John F. Kennedy clobbered, as they say on the sport pages, clobbered his opponent, Cabot Lodge, in that election and moved from the House to the Senate. And inevitably, as almost every other correspondent covering the Hill and the White House in Washington did, this reporter met him personally and socially. He used to like, with his wife, to have little dinners at his house on N Street in Georgetown. Anything but pretentious dinners they were. A couple of correspondents and their wives or girls, some official of the government, some colleague from the Senate, sitting down to a good dinner and having good, serious talk with a little banter from Mrs. Kennedy with her delicious wit thrown in between to spice the courses, so to speak. I remember that I felt it necessary at that point, at one time, to repay the hospitality of the then Senator Kennedy, and I invited him and Mrs. Kennedy to my house for dinner one night in Georgetown. They accepted. I remember that Dean Acheson and his wife were a couple of the other guests, but as the time for dinner came, I, as the host, and I suppose most hosts and hostesses do in this particular position, began to squirm because the Kennedys had not arrived. A half hour went by, and they still hadn't arrived. 45 minutes went by. Myself and my other guests were there, nervously drinking our drinks. The dinner was getting overcooked, and then the telephone rang. It was Senator Kennedy. He was all profuse apologies. By some unavoidable but unfortunate mix-up, he had been given my office number at ABC way out on Connecticut Avenue instead of my home, and he would be there in a moment. Needless to say, there was great relief. They came, and we had a lively evening. I didn't know until that moment that there had been a certain sharpness between the former Secretary of State, Mr. Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and the Senator, partly because the elder man who had been versed greatly in affairs of state and diplomacy, thought that the younger man was something of an upstart. And he was a bit, more than a bit, put back by Mr. Kennedy's speech in the Senate, which became celebrated at the time, denouncing the Western approach, and particularly the Washington approach. That would have been the policy of the then Eisenhower administration toward the situation of the Algerian War. And there were a few sharp, if controlled, exchanges between the two that evening, but it led eventually to a very close working relationship and, again, mutual respect between the two. The next morning, I received by special delivery a package from Mrs. Kennedy, along with a charming note saying how much she and her husband had enjoyed the evening, and would I accept in apology a little pot of Strasbourg pâté de foie gras. I did with relish. This was the way the senator worked himself into the respect and into the affection, I might say, of a good deal of correspondence in Washington, treating with them easily, being easily accessible, being frank with his relationships. And there are others much more intimate who were much more intimate with him than I, who could tell many other stories about him. The situation, it goes back to his nomination in 1960, when it was incredible that Lyndon Johnson be on the ticket. But I happened to be in the automobile with him the afternoon of the crucial vote on his own nomination, and asked him if he were nominated, as he was confident that he would it be Hubert Humphrey, his running mate, or who? And he said, no, no, no. If I get it, we'll have to start all over again. And if I, as a correspondent, had had any sense, I would have known then that he was thinking actively of Lyndon Johnson. Now, I would like to show a videotape of an interview that some of my ABC colleagues and I had some months ago with Lyndon Johnson before he became president.
Vice President, how did you happen to run for the vice presidency?
Well, Bill, after I was defeated for the presidency at Los Angeles, I got my first good night's sleep in several weeks, and the next morning the nominee for president, Mr. Kennedy, called me, and we had a meeting, and he asked me to go on the ticket. I considered it, talked to many of my friends, recognized that there were only two offices in the land which all the people had a choice, and I felt that it offered a good opportunity, that it would be quite a challenge, it would be a different experience for me, that my friends thought it would be good for the party and the country, and I expressed my willingness to accept the nomination, and the convention nominated me.
Still, Mr. Vice President, as majority leader, you had developed a glowing reputation as a wheeler and dealer in the best political sense of those terms. Did you not feel that this was a come down somewhat, your present post?
No, I felt it was a different type of assignment, but actually I felt that it offered opportunities that I had really never had before in either my service in the House or the Senate. I have never felt that the vice presidency had come down from anything except the presidency.
Mr. Vice President, through history, this office, though, has not enjoyed the highest repute, and many of the men who served in it, many of them less active than you, have felt their time and talents wasted. Since you've been in office now, have you found it to be a satisfying and a challenging job for an active man?
Yes, I've been very gratified at the opportunities that have come my way. I think what you do largely depends upon your relationship with the President and what the President wishes you to do. Although in the last few years, since President Garner, the 33rd Vice President, and Vice President Wallace and Vice President Nixon, additional responsibilities have been added to the office. Like under President Truman's administration, the Vice President was made a member of the Security Council. Under President Eisenhower's administration, the Vice President was placed in charge of the government contracts program. Under President Kennedy, the Vice President has been made chairman of the Peace Corps Advisory Committee, has been placed on the Space Council by statute and recommendation of the President as chairman of the Space Council, has participated in the deliberations of the Security Council, and I think that it has given me a very good outlet for such talents and energies as I've had, and the President has been very understanding and asked me to undertake assignments from time to time, which have been quite challenging and very gratifying.
Well, certainly the office has changed, Mr. Vice President. What would be the Lyndon Johnson definition of the Vice Presidency to a student of politics? Maybe a one-sentence definition, if possible.
Well, I don't know that I could keep it to one sentence, but the Constitution provides that he shall preside over the Senate, and the law provides that he shall preside over the Space Council, be a member of the Security Council, preside over the Peace Corps Council, sit in the cabinet meetings at the President's invitation, and then I would say do whatever the President asks him to do.
Well, Mr. Vice President, as recently, say, as Dawes, Mr. Hoover's Vice President, the Vice President was really, though, just the presiding officer of the Senate. He had no executive responsibilities. Do you find this a happy melding of your talents now, that you can do certain work in the executive branch as the President wishes and yet carry out your constitutional function?
Oh, yes, I think I would be quite dissatisfied if the only assignment I had would be to preside over the Senate.
It's often been said that Mr. Truman, with only this very brief period in the Vice Presidency, felt himself totally unprepared for the presidency the day it suddenly came to him, that he was not informed about such important matters as the atomic bomb, about some of the political arrangements that have been made with our allies abroad. I take it that this has had a happier change now, and that you do feel informed, consulted, and prepared if the day should come quickly when you might have to become the President yourself.
I think that's a correct statement, Mr. Lawrence. President Kennedy and the members of his staff and his cabinet have given me every opportunity to be aware of all the important decisions that have been made and to participate in them and to make any recommendation I cared to make. And I have been a part of those decisions. Some important ones. The deliberations in connection with the invasion of Cuba, and again last October when we had the missile crisis in Cuba. We had some 35 National Security Council meetings, meetings of the Executive Committee of the Security Council, which I was a member, and I participated in all but one of those meetings. Recommendations were asked and received, considered, and in both instances, I was a party to both decisions.
Go ahead,
Mr. Vice President, you've made...
Although I want to make it abundantly clear that the responsibility is with the President, and the President made the decision.
Could you project a tiny bit into the future? Can you see anything specifically tangible coming? Negro stewardesses on airlines, something of that kind. Are you encouraged about it?
Oh yes, we've had many breakthroughs. We already have Negro stewardesses on airlines as a result of our specific request to various companies, and we have had many breakthroughs. Our big problem is our educational problem.
What do you mean by
Dr.
that?
Wiesner was talking with me yesterday, and he made a presentation to the presidents of many universities who are here now. We have not been fair with the Negro and his education. He hasn't had adequate and ample education to permit him to qualify for many jobs that are open to him. And most of our manufacturing plants, our industrial plants, our government contractors, they have many more jobs for Negroes than Negroes can qualify for. So our problem is to get the union to take them in and give them apprentice training. Our problem is to have them retrained. Our problem is to give them ample educational opportunities. Our problem is to try to remove the inequality that exists in their training, because once they have adequate training, they can qualify, and if they can qualify, many of the big companies will give them jobs.
Do you remain confident that we can put a man on the moon in the 60s, and are you confident that we'll be first?
Well, I'm confident that in the 60s that we will put a man on the moon, and I'm not in a position to say now who will get there first.
Mr. Vice President.
I think that we're going to do a good, constructive, responsible job in this field. And I don't think that it's just a competition that is determining what we do. I think we want to be sure that our people, not only have leadership, but have available all the knowledge that it's possible to acquire. And I think we're doing that in a solid, responsible way. Some recommendations made, we could spend a few $100 million more and speed it up a few days or a few weeks. But we have been deliberate and prudent, and at the same time, I think with our eyes on the stars, we've kept our feet on the ground. I think we have a good space program, and I think the President will be remembered for the courage and initiative it took to get this going.
Mr. Vice President, these two major new responsibilities of the Vice Presidency in civil rights and in space turn out to coincide with the two fields in which you take the greatest personal pride for your activities in Congress, civil rights and space. Some people might be tempted to conclude that the Vice Presidency these days is what the man who occupies it makes it, in the sense that he carries his own interests into shaping the job. Would that be correct?
Yes, I think there's some merit to that, although I would want to, objectively, I should have to say that my predecessor, Mr. Nixon, was very interested in this field, and President Eisenhower blazed the trail by appointing him as chairman of our predecessor committee, the Committee on Government Contracts. And he was quite interested in that field. I think, however, more depends not on the desire or the ambition of the person who is vice president, as it depends upon the judgment and the decision of the man who's president. We don't have assistant president. We don't have a co-president. We don't have an acting president under our system. We have one man that's president, that's commander-in-chief, and he's the only president we have. And we look to him for leadership. Now, he has a right to call upon anyone in this country for his services. And the vice president, in recent years, the president has usually influenced the selection of his vice president, recommended it. And in that case, he naturally feels that he's at liberty to call on him. So what the vice president does is largely determined by what the president wants him to do, provided Congress concurs.
The president has rather strongly indicated already, Mr. Vice President, that he will be a candidate for re-election in 1964, and that if you are willing, he would be happy to have you run with him. What is your reaction to this?
I'm very interested in what we're going to do in 63. I think that who is nominated in 64 will depend upon the delegates who have not yet been selected. I would certainly hope that the delegates who are selected would look with approval upon the work that the President has done and that I have attempted to do. But so far as crossing that bridge right now, I think that's a matter for the delegates to determine. And I'm a great admirer of the President's leadership, and I have been for a long time. I asked my state of Texas to support him for vice president in 1956. I passed over many senior members, and Texas did vote for Kennedy for vice president in the 56th convention that he lost. I passed over many men who were applicants for Foreign Relations Committee because I thought Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts possessed unusual attributes and unusual leadership qualities and unusual abilities in this field. I have been very happy to see that his service as president confirmed the early estimates that a good many people had of him when he was a member of the Senate. And I hope the people of the country will realize the burdensome responsibilities he's carrying and how effectively he's handled this job.
Mr. Vice President, you are a political realist above all things. You wouldn't want to leave any doubt that the delegates to the Democratic Convention would have any other idea than renominating John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson if Lyndon Johnson wants to go.
I expressed my hope in that matter, and I gave you my view of what I thought of this administration's record and my approval of it. All I'm saying is that I'm not authorized at this moment to make the decision for the delegates.
Mr. Vice President, I ask this question generally as well as specifically. Does a man, an accomplished politician such as yourself, who has once reached for the presidency, at least for the nomination, and failed, reconcile himself not to reach again, or is it in his blood and he would like to?
Well, Mr. Morgan, I don't consider that I have ever reached for the presidency. My friends put me in the race in 1960. They felt that they should have representation and that my name should go before the convention. I doubted the advisability of that, and so stated on many occasions. And over on that desk, I was looking this morning at my announcement as late as July the 5th when I announced that I would allow my name to go before the convention. I did not at that time feel that I was seeking the presidency. My friends thought they ought to have an opportunity to vote for me, and I agreed. But that's the way I felt about it. I didn't feel I was a candidate. I didn't go into any of the primaries. I didn't go out and ask any delegations to commit themselves to me in 1960, and I have no plans to do so now.
Mr. Vice President, I suppose really this conversation has already answered this last question, but let's see if you would sum it up for us. How are you enjoying life these days?
We face many problems. We live in a critical area. I'm quite concerned about the day-to-day developments. From a personal standpoint, I'm very happy. I have everything a man could want. I have a fine relationship with the people with whom I work. I have a lovely family. I enjoy my work. I left my desk after 9 o'clock last night. I have an opportunity to meet the leaders of the world. I go out and see the people of the world, whether they're in the streets of Santo Domingo, on the sandy roads of Karachi, or whether it's a camel driver, or a king, or a prime minister. And I'm constantly thankful and grateful that my country and my parents have given me the opportunity to share in the achievements of this time.
Thank you.
I'd say I'm very happy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
That was the videotape of a special program on Lyndon Johnson last March 26th on his role as vice president, a time when many thought he might have been lost in the shuffle of governmental bureaucracy. Included were ABC correspondents Bill Lawrence, John Rolfson, Edward P. Morgan. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas today despite the most elaborate precautions taken by his Secret Service bodyguards. The agents had checked into all aspects of the president's visit, the food he would eat, the roads he would travel, the buildings he would enter, even the flowers that he would smell. The Secret Service men were reluctant about permitting the president to speak in the Dallas trademark because of the tiers of balcony balconies overlooking the main court there, giving a potential assassin a good opportunity to hide, then shoot down when the president did appear. The president went ahead anyway. A list of known agitators in Dallas, anyone who might conceivably stir up trouble, was obtained from local lawmen. The Secret Service men made themselves familiar with these persons and their patterns, but they missed one man, the assassin. The motorcade route was thoroughly checked out. Trouble spots were noted, particularly where traffic or crowd conditions might get out of hand. It is the motorcade, above all, that the Secret Service men worry about most. Chief executives riding in open cars down crowded streets are extremely vulnerable as targets for assassination. But agents point out that it is impossible to check every occupant entering parade route buildings on the day of a motorcade, and this, in effect, is what happened. One man holed up in one building along a long motorcade route with a rifle and a telescopic sight. He was as hard to find or to spot as the proverbial needle in a haystack. He shot to kill. He shot with deadly accuracy. Using a bolt-action rifle, he fired 3 bullets unusually swiftly, as if he had trained for this murder for a long time. One bullet hit the president's head. Another bullet seriously wounded Texas Governor John Connally. The latest news of John Connally comes from Memorial Hospital in Dallas, where Dr. Robert Shaw performed surgery on the bullet-wounded governor of Texas. Dr. Shaw has said that he anticipated no permanent damage. He also said that President Kennedy's death had not been mentioned to the 46-year-old governor, who was Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. In Dr. Shaw's words, Connally, who was wounded by 1 bullet through the right shoulder, was perfectly lucid and talked no more than any other injured man would have. The city of Dallas is in deepest mourning. Tomorrow's edition of the Dallas Morning News carries an editorial saying that the city bows its head in the incredible shock of the president's assassination. The editorial goes on, quote, "It cannot be charged with fairness that an entire city is in national disgrace, but certainly its reputation has suffered regrettable damage," end of quote. More from Dallas now as we join our ABC affiliate there, WFAA-TV, and Jay Watson.
Thank you, Bob. A few other sidelights on John Connally. As I understand, complete facilities have been moved into Parkland Hospital so that the state government is now located there, and the government can be run, the state government can be run from Parkland Hospital. The governor is mentally alert and comfortable, although he has not yet asked about Mr. Kennedy, so therefore he does not know that the president is dead. 1 rib had to be removed during the 4-hour operation, lung repaired, and I understand that his left wrist is shattered pretty bad. The bullet passed clear through his body. Bill Lord has been at the police station for the last 4 or 5 hours, right, Bill?
Good afternoon, yes.
Tell us what's happening down there, will you?
Well, I got to the police station about 2 o'clock this afternoon. There were about 20 newsmen there at the time. 2 hours later, there were over 200 newsmen. And this gives you an idea as to just what the scene was this afternoon in the police station. In a moment, you'll see the suspect, Lee Oswald, come out, and we'll ask him some questions. It was a very almost riotous scene in the police station as the press was fighting each other trying to get here.
Representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about. Kill the president? No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking.
Sir, people keep asking him that, but I knew nothing about it at all. Paul Good is at police headquarters, and he just phoned in saying that the police chief said they are sure they have the right man, yet he is not cracking yet under the intensive questioning.
So he's been holding up how many hours now has he been interrogated by the police department? About 4 or 5, 6 hours somewhere.
Close to 6 hours.
Bill, where were you? Tell us about where you were in Dallas today and what the reaction was.
Well, I was here in Dallas today, right here in the studios. We had been planning extensive coverage of the president's trip to Texas, and I just been looking at some of the tape fed in from the airport on Dallas's welcoming of the president, which was very warm to say the least. And we heard about it. We ran over to the sheriff's office, which is right near the spot. In fact, it's only a block away from where the president was assassinated. And everyone we talked to couldn't believe that this had happened. Yet it had, and the sheriff, all were very disturbed that this had happened in Dallas, that it had happened at all.
Were you at the police station long enough? Did you see the suspect long enough to get an impression of what he was like? Did you feel like that the man was possibly deranged? Did he act, outside of it?
This would be difficult to estimate because we only saw him, we did see him about 4 times, a scene like that repeated over and over again as they bring him down from the city jail to be looked at by people who witnessed the assassination.
Was he by himself? Does he have family with him? Or?
His wife is there. His wife is a Russian-born, now American citizen. She speaks nothing but Russian, and they were having difficulty interrogating her. His face was all bruised up. And police indicate that this occurred when he tried to fight off arresting policemen of the theater after he had shot Patrolman Tippett. And he has been charged for murder of Patrolman Tippett. And sources at the police station expect that before midnight or certainly before sunrise, if they have any additional positive clues, then he will be charged with murder of the president.
Dixie, what about the police departments? You were talking with them and visiting with them. What is their attitude about the assassination? Is there, the feeling of dejection? Did you have any personal comments or angles from any of the policemen?
I spoke to several, and all they said was, we gave the Secret Service more men than they asked for. And no matter how many men we gave them, we couldn't possibly prevent our crackpot from taking the shot that he did.
It's impossible, isn't it? Impossible. This is a feed from Dallas, Texas for the ABC network. A few moments ago, Bob Clark, and also with ABC, the same way as Bill Lord here is from ABC. A few minutes ago, Bob Clark interviewed the mayor of the city of Dallas, Mayor Earl Cabell. I think that tape is ready now, so let's take a look at that.
Mr. Mayor, you know the mood of the people of Dallas as well as anyone tonight. What is the reaction of the citizens of this city to the assassination of President Kennedy?
Well, the reaction this evening is one of shock, is one of grief, and it's one of, they just can't believe it. Because with the tremendous outpouring of warmth, enthusiasm that was so manifest throughout the entire course of the parade route today. And then when this thing happened, it was just unbelievable.
Your police force has done a magnificent job since the shooting this morning. Do you feel that the city did everything possible to give the president complete protection during his visit?
There is no question whatsoever in my mind that every possible security precaution was taken. Every off-duty officer was called on to duty. We had several hundred reserves who were on duty. We had several hundred of the sheriff's department. And not only had they taken every precaution possible on their own, but worked in very close collaboration with and under the supervision of the Secret Service. It was just one of those things that couldn't happen. But it did.
Dallas has become something of a storm center of right-wing extremists in the last year or two. Do you think this could have contributed in any way to the assassination of the president?
I don't want to point my finger at anyone in a case like this. Dallas has its right-wing radical group. It has its left-wing radical group, just like other cities. I think that they're much more vocal than they are numerous. And I can't conscientiously ascribe this. This is not a time to point the finger at anything except just the conscience of the nation as a whole.
You don't think the type of incident that occurred here recently when Adlai Stevenson was spat upon after a Dallas speech could have contributed in any way to today's tragedy?
I sincerely do not believe that it did, because while those people were guilty of terribly bad behavior, I don't think that any one of them involved in that had any criminal intent, nor would they be guilty of anything such as this. I can't correlate the two at all.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much.
Thank you for permitting me to be with you.
Bob Clark and Mayor Earl Cabell, Mayor of the City of Dallas. Bill, before we kick it back to New York, how about a wrap-up of what's happening now at the police department?
Where it stands now, Lee Oswald, who is 25 years old, is accused of murdering first a Dallas policeman, and secondly, they are working very hard at making a case against him for killing the President of the United States. And that's it.
And that's quick enough. A sidelight, a few minutes ago, I talked to one of our reporters who came in, and he said that there are hundreds and maybe, he said thousands, I would imagine there are hundreds of people out in their cars driving around the area. The city of Dallas is milling around, particularly in the area where the president was killed. There are traffic jams all the way through. The entire city is still in a state of shock. That's it for now. We will keep you up to date. Back to New York.
Thank you, Jay Watson, Bill Lord, and Bob Clark in Dallas. And here in New York, some useful background commentary now toward our understanding of the sometimes politically volatile situation in Texas and in Dallas, too, from my Texan-born colleague, ABC's Murphy Martin.
The fact that Texas has more electoral votes than any other southern state, 25, this does not reflect the entire inner struggle for political domination there. Until 1952, Texas had always been considered a Democratic state. After Governor Allen Shivers led the conservative Democratic elements of the state into the Eisenhower fold in 1952, the battle between liberals and conservatives grew more intense. And in addition to liberals and conservatives, extremist groups were suddenly more in evidence. The John Birch Society and the National Indignation Convention were among the groups heard from most often. Before the 1960 election, Mr. and Mrs. Lyndon Johnson narrowly escaped injury when they were mobbed and spat on in the lobby of a Dallas hotel where Mr. Johnson had gone to speak. But although many liberal Texas Democrats were not strong supporters of Mr. Johnson being placed on that 1960 Democratic ticket, the Democrats regained the state's electoral votes with the popular vote plurality of 46,000 over Dick Nixon out of more than 2 million votes cast in 1960. Perhaps one reason for the added police protection in Dallas today for Mr. Kennedy was an incident that occurred on October 24th of this year. UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was in Dallas that day to give a speech on UN Day at Municipal Auditorium. After being booed by the audience, certain members of the audience, he made the speech, and when leaving the building, he was spat upon, jeered, and one woman picket hit him with a sign. At that particular time, as officers moved in to apparently arrest the woman, Mr. Stevenson said, "Don't arrest her. It could have been an accident. Wait a minute, I want to talk to her." He walked over to where officers were holding the woman and asked, "What is wrong? What do you want?" The woman replied, "Why are you like you are? Why don't you understand? If you don't know what's wrong, I don't know why. Everyone else does." Mr. Stevenson replied, "Just don't hit anyone." Stevenson said that he did not want to send them to jail, talking about the demonstrators. "I want to send them to school." 100 business leaders of Dallas, after this outbreak and this demonstration against UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, the business leaders sent telegrams to Stevenson in which they said the city was, quote, outraged and ashamed of the disgraceful discourtesies that he suffered while in Dallas. And it is also interesting to note that prior to Mr. Kennedy's scheduled trip to Texas today, apparently to mend some of the political fences there, originally he was not scheduled to have the downtown parade through Dallas. But after some of the liberal Texas Democrats said that the allotment of tickets to the scheduled dinner in Dallas this noon had not seen enough tickets go to the liberals, after this and after much haggling about it and after a telegram from one of the Democratic liberals of the state, Baxton Bryant, to the White House, in which he said to Mr. Kennedy, "It appears from the allotment of tickets that Mr. Nixon is coming home to his dedicated workers, more so than you're coming here," or words to that effect. After this, the parade was scheduled. But despite the addition of more than 400 additional policemen today, the tragedy still occurred. It might be interesting to note that in addition to the National Indignation Convention and also the John Birchers, Dallas is also the residence of former General Edwin A. Walker. And he has been quoted from time to time in criticizing not only Mr. Kennedy, but the Kennedy administration. In Chicago, February 9th of last year, General Walker was quoted as saying, "Kennedy has never done anything so dramatic as standing on top of Lenin's tomb, but his stroll through the garden with Khrushchev in Vienna last June was evidence of a desire to talk as far as possible with the Soviets."
There were many eyewitnesses to the tragedy today in Dallas, but none with an entirely objective point of view. However, one does exist. He is with Bob Fleming in Washington now, and we switch to ABC's Bob Fleming in the nation's capital.
Two reporters were on the president's plane that came back to Washington this evening. The two presidents' plane, really, President Johnson's and President Kennedy's, for President Kennedy's body was aboard the plane. Charles Roberts of Newsweek magazine was one of the two pool reporters traveling for the media on that plane. Chuck, let's start with the story of the oath of office taken by the president at the airport. Why was it done in the airplane itself?
Bob, the vice president left the hospital shortly after the president died and was rushed to the airport without any announcement as to where he was going for security reasons. The decision was made to get him out of Dallas. He went aboard the plane and they pulled the drapes, the curtains, and then decided to wait and take back President Kennedy's body on that plane.
This was the Air Force One that the president and Mrs. Kennedy had flown to Texas.
The plane that President Kennedy had landed there just 3 hours earlier in. I went aboard the plane at about 2:30, and we were ushered into the conference room on the plane, which is about midships, a small compartment about 12 by 15. And the vice president was standing there with his wife. The judge, who was an old friend of his, had just arrived there a moment before I did.
And this was the lady judge, Sarah T. Hughes?
Yes, who is an old political ally of his. They had found a small leather-bound Bible, not any bigger than that, aboard the plane, and had typed out the oath of office for the president. He was waiting, however, for Mrs. Kennedy to regain her composure and attend the ceremony. She came from the rear of the plane where the president's casket had been placed, and the vice president, or the now president, asked her to stand at his left, and his wife, Lady Bird, stood at his right. The judge, a tiny little woman, then extended the Bible and had the president repeat after her the oath.
Was this an ordeal for Mrs. Kennedy, did you think, or was she?
Her composure was amazing. I actually feel that she was in a state of shock. At this time, her legs were still stained or splattered with blood, and there was blood on this woolen suit she was wearing. But when the chief of police, who had brought the president to the airport, asked her to please go back and lie down, she actually mustered a smile and said, "No, I'm fine, thank you." A few moments after that, she did go to the back of the plane and then spent the whole trip back in the same compartment with the coffin.
What of the Johnsons themselves? Were the new president and Mrs. Johnson also tremendously disturbed, or were they also shocked so that it was hard to tell her emotion?
The president was almost inaudible. He seemed to be under such strain as he took the oath. It was a brief and, of course, very solemn ceremony. It took just 2 minutes, and he was scarcely audible as he ended the oath with "So help me God."
Who were the other people who were there, Chuck?
There were 27. We counted them in this little compartment. There were 3 Democratic congressmen from Texas who had been making this hedge-hopping trip with us, and some Secret Service agents and a number of White House staff officers, Kenny O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, the president's Air Force aide, his military aide, and they had brought Mrs. Kennedy out, or ridden out in the hearse with Mrs. Kennedy.
Was there any word, Chuck, on where the Johnsons' daughters were?
I haven't any idea.
They were not to have been part of the program in the...
There just wasn't time to round up anyone for that ceremony.
I'm sure that can be understood, and that was the story, actually, of the swearing in of the new President of the United States as seen by Charles Roberts of Newsweek aboard the Air Force One just before it left Dallas to return to Washington. Now to Bill Lawrence at the White House.
At this late hour, the crowds around the silent, empty White House are beginning to thin out. The throngs of mourners and the curious who were here earlier in the evening have now disappeared from the streets, and the White House itself is dimly lighted. President Johnson returned to his Spring Valley home a little more than 2 hours ago after working for about 4 hours in his old office as vice president in the executive office building just across the street. The White House has just announced that the body of President Kennedy will be returned to the White House sometime tonight at an hour not yet fixed to be placed in the East Room of the White House where it will lie in repose tomorrow. The President's body will enter through the northwest gate and be driven up to the north portico. The road inside the White House will be lined by soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen, men from all the armed services paying a last tribute to their commander-in-chief. The President's body, as I said, will lie in repose at the White House tomorrow, and on Sunday at 1 o'clock we'll move in a cortege up Pennsylvania Avenue, the famous avenues of the presidents, the road down which Mr. Kennedy rode when he was inaugurated as president back on January 20th, 1961. This cortege will move at 1 o'clock on Sunday, and the body will lie in state for nearly 1 full day. The funeral itself will be held at St. Matthew's Cathedral at 12 noon on Monday, with a pontifical requiem mass to be celebrated by His Eminence Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. The burial plans of the President have not been announced, but it is widely assumed here that he will be buried in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, where his infant son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, was buried last August after he was born and lived barely 39 hours. This is Bill Lawrence at the White House.
Bear the grief of his death until the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love justice and freedom and peace will bow their heads. At such a moment, one can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, and to strengthen President Johnson and to guide us in time to come. May God help us all.
Mr. Governor, have you met with President Johnson yet?
No, I've just arrived from New York and been...
Thank you very much, sir.
That was the statement of our UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson immediately on his arrival in Washington from New York. The priest called to administer last rites of the Roman Catholic Church to the late President Kennedy said tonight that he administered the sacrament conditionally because he didn't know whether the president was alive or dead. Father Oscar Huber of Holy Trinity Church said that when he entered the emergency room at Parkland Memorial Hospital shortly before 1 p.m., that was Central Time, a sheet was drawn over the president's face. He raised the sheet to anoint the body with the holy oil of the sacrament of extreme unction. I couldn't tell whether the president was alive, the priest said. He said he did not know the exact time he entered the room. Father Huber's a native, by the way, of Perryville, Missouri, said he gave conditional absolution of sins to the president, administered conditional extreme unction, and gave the president an apostolic blessing. All rites of the Roman Catholic Church. Now more on the suspected assassin. His name, once again, Lee Harvey Oswald, 25 years old, an ex-Marine who once announced that he would give up his American citizenship to become a Soviet citizen. He's an admitted Marxist, and this late word, police say that it has been officially, or definitely rather, established that Oswald was in the building from which the assassin's bullets were fired. Police say he was in the building at the very time when the president was killed. This in connection with all the other evidence amounting against Oswald at this moment, moment, the fact that he was arrested with a pistol in a theater, the fact that he was identified as the man who shot down a police officer who attempted to question him on the street. Let's recap that story briefly. Oswald was an employee in the 6-story building from which the president was assassinated. Now police say that he was definitely in the building at the time of the assassination. Sometime after the murder, a police officer stopped him, a man identified as Oswald, on a street 4 miles away. But the killer pulled a pistol and shot the officer to death. Then minutes later, a theater owner tipped off police that a man answering the killer's description had entered his theater. 4 policemen invaded that theater. The movie was still going on. There was a dozen people watching it, including Oswald. Oswald spotted the police, jumped to his feet, yelled, "This is it," and pulled a gun. The gun misfired and the police swarmed all over Oswald. He denies all those accusations, but he's been formally charged with killing a police officer now, and he may yet be charged with assassinating the president. What kind of a man is Oswald? Well, he has a strange background. He himself said that he became interested in Marxism at the age of 15. An old lady handed him a pamphlet about saving the Rosenbergs, the spies who handed atomic secrets to the Russians, you'll recall. He joined the Marine Corps at the age of 17 and was discharged as a radar operator, private first class, when he was just 20 years old. Oswald said he discovered Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital, while living in South Dakota. And as he put it, it was like a very religious man opening the Bible for the first time. Those were his words as he read Das Kapital. Here are more of Oswald's own words. "I could see the impoverishment of the masses before my own eyes in my own mother," he said. "I thought the worker's life could be better. I've not been just thinking about this. I've been waiting to do it for 2 years, saving my money, just waiting until I got out of the Marine Corps, like waiting to get out of prison." Shortly after his discharge from the Marine Corps, Oswald turned up in Moscow, and there he told U.S. embassy officials that he was going to become a Soviet citizen. But for some reason he never did. Instead, he married a Russian girl and then returned to the United States. Still burning with a kind of fanaticism, he began working to fulfill his own distorted beliefs. He became a chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. He began passing out pro-Castro pamphlets. He fought on the streets with anti-Castro Cubans. United Press correspondent Aline Mosby interviewed him in Moscow in 1959, and she now recalls that he was a very determined person, but unsure of himself, naive, and emotionally unbalanced. The evidence, both real and circumstantial, seems to be overwhelming against Lee Harvey Oswald at this moment. There is no doubt that he'll stand trial for the murder of the policeman and possibly for the President of the United States as well. Former Vice President Richard Nixon said today that the assassination of the President is a terrible tragedy for the nation. And Mrs. Nixon and I have sent a personal message expressing our deepest sympathy to the members of the family in this hour of sorrow. Mr. Nixon, of course, a resident of New York City at this time, and in New York City, the heart of it, Times Square, ABC's Jules Bergman for this report.
Normally, Times Square at this hour would be packed with tens of thousands of the after-theater crowd. Tonight at this hour, it's almost empty. This city is a portrait in sadness. The feeling here is almost as if it were doomsday. Tens of thousands of people milling about in distraught confusion have now drifted homeward in sadness. Sadness and grief and anger are all mixed here in a darkened Times Square and in the hearts of those who are still here. The only real lights are the aircraft beacons, almost indiscernible from the Empire State Building, and the headlights of autos and buses as they pass our cameras here. Theaters closed, even movies closed, marquees darkened. Cars and buses still roar by, but traffic is lighter than usual, though crowds up to now have been heavier. There is a sense of loss. People are wandering the streets, police told us, confused and searching. Hotel lobbies have been empty, and restaurants almost deserted all evening long. It's like the night before the world came to an end. People are neither excited nor complacent. They are so stunned as to be almost left without emotions here. You don't begin to realize what the president was in the hearts of these people, what he stood for as a man and as a symbol until he is gone. That's the message we gather from this crowd here in Times Square. We should all go home, one young man told us. We should go home to find ourselves, to discover where we are and what we must now do. As with any great loss, New Yorkers here are seeking to find themselves, to recover. New York tonight is a city stunned, a city searching for itself, even as our entire nation is searching for itself. All caused by one psychotic with a $29 surplus rifle and a 10-cent cartridge. This is Jules Bergman, ABC, reporting from Times Square in New York.
Also in New York, where he lives, General Douglas MacArthur sent the following telegram today to Mrs. John F. Kennedy. I realize the utter futility of words at such a time, but the world of civilization shares the poignancy of this monumental tragedy. As a former comrade in arms, his death kills something within me. And Senator Barry Goldwater, already touched himself by a family death, called President Kennedy's assassination a profound loss to the nation and the free world. The Arizona Republican issued a statement on arrival in Chicago, Muncie, where he'll attend funeral services for his mother-in-law on Saturday. It is both shocking and dreadful, said the senator, that a thing like this could happen in a free country. Asked what effect the assassination would have on his political plans for next year, the senator replied, "This won't affect my plans. I don't want to discuss it now. This is certainly no day to even think about politics." Newsmen said that Goldwater appeared extremely upset, even angry. They reported Mrs. Goldwater as obviously having wept considerably today. Goldwater said he'll return to Washington tomorrow morning after the funeral of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Ray Johnson. The three living former presidents expressed shock and grief at the death of President Kennedy by an assassin's bullet. Harry S. Truman said at first that he was too shaken to comment. Later he said, "I'm shocked beyond words at the tragedy that has happened to our country and to President Kennedy's family today." Herbert Hoover, who was president from 1928 to 1932, said he loved America and has given his life for his country. Dwight Eisenhower, who preceded Mr. Kennedy in the White House, of course, said in a statement, "I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's president." Eisenhower and Hoover were both in New York City, Mr. Truman at his home in Independence, Missouri. Mr. Truman at least will be on hand in Washington over the weekend before services start for Mr. Kennedy on Monday. The United States Secret Service, about which we talked and about which Jim Haggerty, who has had particular acquaintance with them as former press secretary to former President Eisenhower, has feared a motorcade assassination attempt more than anything else. It's been the guardian of American presidents for 61 years. In private conversations and in books published by top officials after they left the service, agents admitted that chief executives riding in open cars down crowded city streets were at their most vulnerable as the targets of assassination. Grieving most tonight, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and here in our studios in New York, Lisa Howard with a portrait of Mrs. Kennedy.
Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy is no longer the First Lady of our land. She was our First Lady just 6 weeks shy of 3 years, but she has, without question, left her indelible mark on history. The daughter of a socially prominent New York family, Mrs. Kennedy led the life of a wealthy Eastern debutante and had absolutely no interest in politics. But with her marriage to then Senator John F. Kennedy on September 12th at a large, formal, very social wedding at Newport, Rhode Island, she was thrust onto center stage and the spotlight burned fiercely. Her radiant good looks, her charm, her elegance, her special flair attracted international attention from the moment her husband was elected to the presidency of the United States. The late president once said that Mrs. Kennedy's interests were aesthetic and cultural, and her life in the White House reflected that assessment. During her first year as First Lady, she devoted herself assiduously to the task of redecorating the White House, to making it historically authentic. And once the White House rooms were restored to their original state, she conducted a television tour of the first family's home. The whole nation was charmed and beguiled by Mrs. Kennedy's hushed little girl tones, by her genuine delight in what she had accomplished. Her unusual and frequent White House parties were the talk of Washington, a sunset cruise down the Potomac, a lawn party at Mount Vernon for 138, Pablo Casals playing the cello in the East Wing of the White House. Mrs. Kennedy, as First Lady, traveled widely, to France, England, Italy, India, Pakistan, Greece, and Morocco. And everywhere she went, she dazzled the crowds. No one was immune from her charms. Neither Mrs. Khrushchev, nor Ayub Khan, nor Nehru, nor Pope John, with whom she had an unusually long audience. And among the crowd, she could engender overwhelming enthusiasm and even affection. Her comings and goings in the capitals of Europe and Asia were followed by sometimes hysterical cheers and promptly reported over half the world. Her role on these travels was unique in American history. Often alone, without the president at her side, she received the endless bouquets from children, attended state banquets, waved to the massed throngs, always cool and elegant, always refraining from making any political comment. No American First Lady in history had ever traveled about in quite this capacity, for it was a purely ceremonial and decorative role. But she generated enormous goodwill for our country everywhere she went. When she lost her third child, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, after only 2 days of life, the whole country felt a wave of sympathy as she emerged from the hospital at Otis Air Force Base hand in hand with her husband. Mrs. Kennedy often made known her dislike of the unrelenting attention attendant upon her comings and goings, the constant surveillance of reporters and photographers. And in all fairness, it must be stated that she did not court all that press attention. It courted her, attracted by her unique beauty and special radiance. But despite her desire for a private life, Mrs. John F. Kennedy now departs the White House, one of the most photographed women in the world, a public personality in her own right, a woman historians are not likely to forget. Lisa Howard, ABC News. And now back to Bob Young.
Thank you, Lisa. Mrs. Kennedy is still at Bethesda Hospital tonight, and she's expected to remain in an all-night vigil at her husband's side. Tomorrow, she'll accompany the president's body to the White House, where Mr. Kennedy will lie in state in the East Room beginning at 10 a.m. ABC will take the air with additional coverage of the death of President Kennedy at the following local times: at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 a.m. Central Time, 7:30 Mountain, and 6:30 Pacific Standard Time. Threatening the life of a chief executive is a criminal offense. Hundreds of times the Secret Service has sworn out warrants against potential assassins to keep them behind bars until the president has left a scene. Agents assigned to the White House detail are the elite of the service. Each must have 2 years of field service. They must be trained in foreign languages. They must pass ruthless tests in marksmanship, judo, and even first aid. They're trained never to watch the president himself, but the people and crowds around him. They also are sworn to throw themselves in front of their trust at the first indication of gunfire, to take bullets if possible, which might be meant for the chief executive. There's no doubt that every agent would have sacrificed his life for John Fitzgerald Kennedy today if he'd had a chance to. Michael Riley, one of the agents who guarded Franklin Roosevelt during the war years, remarked once, "Every man who joins the service is told he's expected to use his body as a shield if necessary, and if the agent didn't think the risk was worth the salary, he could work in any of 15 other Secret Service districts in the United States." There are two absolute rules for motorcade protection. The agent running or riding at the president's shoulder must never leave that position unless relieved. And the other is to turn out the manpower in all Secret Service cars the moment trouble arises and literally get Secret Service bodies around the president. Violent death is no stranger to the family of Joseph P. Kennedy. Along with great wealth and political triumph, many tragedies have come to the Irish-American clan from Boston. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the elder brother of the assassinated president, you recall, was lost in action in World War II. A Navy pilot, Kennedy vanished on an air mission from England to occupied Europe in 1944. This was the son who originally had borne the political hopes of the family, but did not live to enter this field. For many years, another sister, Rosemary, has been in an institution for the mentally retarded, a cause for which the entire Kennedy family has done much. It was this misfortune that spurred the family's interest in programs for prevention and treatment of mental retardation. A family foundation named for Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. has contributed large sums to this cause, and only last month, President Kennedy signed bills providing millions in federal funds to help combat this affliction. From Dallas, Justice of the Peace David Johnson said tonight he doubted if the person who killed President Kennedy would be tried on any federal charges. Johnson said there is no such federal charge as assassination, and the law books contain nothing about the murder of a president. The only record of an assassin being tried on a federal charge was when a military tribunal convicted the slayer of President James A. Garfield. The apparent basis for that trial was that Garfield, as president, of course, was commander-in-chief of our military might, and thus his killer could be tried under military law. ABC will be on the air most of this evening up through 2 a.m. at least, with further details on the tragedy of today. Pope Paul VI prayed tonight for the soul of President Kennedy. The Pope received the news only a few minutes after the president died. And, of course, you'll recall that President Kennedy was received in audience by the Pope June 2nd of this year during his visit to Europe and visit to Rome specifically in that case. The head of the Kennedy clan, Joseph P. Kennedy himself, of course, suffered a stroke in December of 1961 and never has recovered normal speech or the ability to walk. For the First Lady, the former Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, today's tragedy ended a 10-year marriage marked by many moments of loss. Twice, miscarriages robbed her of babies, and last August, a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, of course, died 2 days after his premature death. The latest news on Governor John Connally of Texas from Memorial Hospital in Dallas, where Dr. Robert Shaw performed surgery on the bullet-wounded governor, is that he had anticipated, Dr. Shaw says, no permanent damage, but he also said that President Kennedy's death had not been mentioned to the 46-year-old governor, who was Mr. Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. In Mr. Shaw's words, Connally, who was wounded by one bullet through the right shoulder, was perfectly lucid and talked no more than any injured man would under the circumstances. Stay tuned now for an ABC News special on President Lyndon B. Johnson.
I can't, geez, you gotta do better than that.
Shortly after 6 o'clock tonight, Lyndon Baines Johnson arrived in Washington and made his first official statement as President of the United States.
It is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help. Thank God.
ABC News now presents a special on the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Here is ABC News correspondent John Secondary.
Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as 36th President of the United States at 3:29 this afternoon, about an hour and a half after President Kennedy's death. The ceremony took place inside Air Force One, the place which had carried President Kennedy to Texas. The oath was administered by federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes, an old friend of the Johnson family. It was the first time that a President of the United States had been sworn in by a woman. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy were at the new president's side as he took the oath. President Kennedy's body was in the plane. It was a grim, silent ceremony, unlike the usual festive swearing-ins. The whole business lasted only 2 minutes, and then Johnson gave his first order as president. He said, "Let's get airborne." From the airplane, President Johnson telephoned Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the assassinated president's mother. He told her, "I wish to God there was something I could do. I wanted you to know that." He then passed the telephone receiver to Mrs. Johnson, and she said, "We feel like the heart has been cut out of us." In Washington, the president tonight went to his old office near the White House at the Executive House, where he met with congressional leaders and other officials, and then he went to his own home in Washington's Spring Valley. He did not stay in the White House this night. President Johnson steps into a tough spot. All vice presidents do. He has some advantages, some drawbacks. He's a Southerner. This is one of the reasons why he was chosen as President Kennedy's running mate. But he's also a staunch supporter of the civil rights program. His initial reputation was made as a politician, a shrewd, wheeling-dealing politician. But in recent years, he's acquired some of the aura of a statesman. The new first family consists of Mrs. and Mr. Johnson and their 2 teenage daughters. Their home is a Texas ranch in Johnson City. Johnson is 6'3", 200 pounds. He was born on August 27, 1908. Mrs. Johnson was born Claudia Alta Taylor in a town called Carmack, deep in East Texas. A maid, when she was a baby, referred to her, "She's as pretty as a ladybird," and since then the name has stuck. She is now known and has always been known as Lady Bird. Their 2 daughters are Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, and all 4 Johnsons have the initials LBJ. In fact, the initials are something of a family totem. Johnson was elected to Congress in 1937. His grandfather, very proud, said of him, "He'll be a senator someday." And in fact, in 1948, the prophecy did come true. Johnson was elected to the Senate by a margin of 87 votes. 4 years later, in 1952, then Senator Johnson was chosen by the Senate Democrats as their majority leader, the youngest in history. He was only 44 years old at the time. And when the Democrats came to power, he became the Senate Majority Leader. And for the next 3 terms of Congress, he earned a reputation as a most skilled parliamentarian. In 1955, while in Middleburg, Virginia, he suffered a severe heart attack. And for a while, he hovered near death. It was thought that even if he did live, he would have to retire from the strenuous political life. But he fought back. And a few months after the hospital bed, he was making jokes about his ailment.
You know, it was almost 4 months ago that I was stricken with a heart attack. 3 days afterwards, Lady Bird came in my room, and I decided I'd better do a little detective work. And I said, "Honey, I don't think there's much use. The doctors don't think I've got 1 chance out of 10 to live, do they?" And she said, "Oh, yes, they do. They think it's 50-50.
5 years later, Senator Johnson was battling Senator Kennedy for the Democratic presidential nomination. He was regarded as a reactionary Democrat. Kennedy was a liberal, and when Kennedy won out and chose Johnson to be his running mate, there was many doubts in many minds as to how this political marriage might work out. The 2 were political adversaries, deeply. Their political philosophies seemed to completely differ. Their backgrounds were different. Kennedy was a northern intellectual. Johnson was a southerner, a politician. But Johnson turned out to be not only a good loser, but also a faithful aide. He gave an indication the future relations to the president would be in his acceptance speech at Los Angeles in 1960.
I know when I see political genius, and I have seen it in my friend John F. Kennedy. The Democrats of this nation are going all the way with JFK. much more. My task in the Senate are the task of leadership, of knowing men, of seeing into them, of knowing what they're made of. Long ago, when both of us were in the House of Representatives together, serving under Mr. Sam, I saw inside this man the steel of strength that is all too rare. And I have watched with unabashed pride, as he knows, as these qualities have come forth in the Senate. In these times, this is the man America will choose. This is the man that you and all your countrymen can trust to be the trustee for your children's future. There is character here. There is quality here. There is greatness here. And if, as he said the other day, he has learned something from me, I'm sure that I've learned a great deal also from him. To him, I want to express my gratitude for his confidence in me, and my humility at the compliment, which is mine to share this moment of opportunity with him. For that I am grateful. More especially, in a more personal way, I am grateful and I'm proud. I'm proud of the bond of friendship which formed long ago, and proud that it's still holding fast. Fast as I knew it would be, just as soon as we finished our lawsuit and the jury came in with a verdict. So I say to you this evening, it is this quality of our American life and our American system which more than most any other reaffirms my faith not only in the greatness of the system, but in the greatness of the human race. Wherever he wants me to go, I will go. For the party, for the nation. I will go because I know we both want America to go up the same road toward greatness.
Johnson pledged fealty not only to Kennedy the man, but also to the president's policies. Himself a Protestant, he campaigned throughout the country for Kennedy the Catholic, for civil rights, for things that the country was unaware he stood for. He invaded the North, country not particularly friendly to him at the time, and managed to cause some of the doubters to wonder. Here's a section from one of his campaign speeches in New York.
Start measuring men's qualifications by their race or their religion or their region. If we can ignore the Bill of Rights, flaunt the Constitution, and say that Senator Kennedy is qualified to serve his country in the House and the Senate and in the service, and break his back hauling his crew members out of the oily ocean to save their life, but he is not qualified to be president because he's a Catholic. Then to follow that logic to its logical conclusion tomorrow, you could say that Governor Ribbentrop could not be governor because he's a Jew, or it would really be a national disaster that I couldn't be a senator because I belong to a Christian church, or that someone else couldn't be a president because he was a Baptist or Episcopalian. And if you did that all down the line and applied the same test to each church, you'd ultimately wind up with no one qualified or available for the presidency except someone who did not believe in God at all, or some atheist or communist. And that would be doing Mr. Khrushchev's job for him. That's what he wants us to do.
Lyndon Johnson as vice president. His friends just couldn't see the bustling senator in that recessive role. How would Lyndon Johnson cope with it? Would he compete with the president, or would he recede so far into the background as to almost achieve political obscurity? That was the question. Well, Lyndon Johnson traveled. He made Wendell Willkie and Richard Nixon, who were earlier globetrotters, look like pikers. For instance, this is Berlin, where Johnson brought President Kennedy's message of bear up to Germans living in the shadow of the wall, where he talked with the people and with the leaders. Lyndon Johnson's travels took him north and south, east and west, and he took to varying climes the way a politician takes to groups of minority voters. The big laugh, the big smile. The crowds were even more friendly, if that's possible, in Turkey, that staunch ally on the Soviet flank. And as Lyndon Johnson's motorcade swept through Ankara, it demonstrated that amity. Johnson sometimes had messages of import for the leaders, but the message for the crowds was nothing but amity in Turkey and
We
Rome.
bring to you from the President of the United States his very warm wishes and his personal congratulations. For many years, there has been a traditional friendship between your country and mine. And we have come here today to meet with you, to share with you, to join with you in the pleasure that comes from independence and from freedom. And together we are going to work toward a peaceful world, a prosperous world, where our children can be healthy, our children can be well fed, and our people can be housed and educated. We have the same goals, we have the same ambitions, and by marching together, we shall reach those goals. It is a great privilege to be welcomed in such a manner. I know we will enjoy our visit with you.
And Johnson delivered his message to Norway, which gave him a welcome quite opposite its weather. He repeated his earliest performances in Norway, and while the Norwegians enjoyed the tall Westerner, the newspapers back home reported each new success. So Lyndon Johnson evaded obscurity at home, even while traveling to the furthest points of the compass. He shook hands with Antonio Segni and hundreds of other foreign government officials. And he learned how to spell Texas in Greek. And then he returned the favor by giving a lesson in exuberant and not inexpert dancing. Lyndon Johnson traveled. He served the president, and yet he avoided obscurity. One of Johnson's more publicized adventures was his meeting in Pakistan with a camel driver, Bashir Ahmad. Johnson toured Asia, you know, as if he were back at home in Texas, campaigning every minute of it. He met the people, he kissed babies, he shook hands, and when he met the camel driver, he gave him a souvenir pencil and told him he hoped to see him in America someday. That was in June 1961. 5 months later, Ahmad flew to Texas to repay Johnson's visit. He became the most famous camel driver in all of Pakistan. Under Johnson and President Kennedy, the office of Vice President became more than a nothing office. Vice President Nixon, under President Eisenhower, was given more powers than many vice presidents had received before, but Johnson was given even more. Overseas, he was given authority to make agreements. At home, he was President Kennedy's liaison with Congress. He met frequently with congressional leaders, especially when pressure was needed. His years in the Senate stood him in good stead. The friends he made as a majority leader helped him when it came to getting things done. His knowledge of rules and procedure was put to good use. He coaxed, cajoled when necessary, politicked, and he managed to get things done. As Vice President, Johnson took on so many chores that he needed 3 offices from which to operate. One in the Capitol, in the new Senate office building, and in the White House. He kept a staff of 17 persons on the run, constantly. Last month, President Kennedy was asked whether, if he ran next year, he would again want Johnson as the vice presidential nominee, and whether he expected Johnson to be on the ticket. He replied yes to both those questions. That is correct, he said. One of his jobs was entertaining the president. One of his jobs was entertaining for the president. At his ranch in Texas, where there was all the room in the world, he entertained ambassadors from abroad, as well as congressmen, senators, United Nations delegates, visiting chiefs of state. Texas is noted for its hospitality, and Johnson was noted for being a Texan. There was no book of rules. There were no lack of charcoal steaks, broiled steaks, and when visitors came to the Johnson branch, there was camaraderie and handshaking and good talk. There was conversation about where this country was going and what it was doing to help other countries. And there was talk about civil rights and the Peace Corps, especially when the visitors were from the underdeveloped nations to whom we were rendering aid. The Johnson Ranch was a place where Africans and Asians and Europeans got a taste of Americana. Johnson was a fabulous host. He told his visitors some of the things he stood for. He told them, we have new potentials in this country. We stand at the edge of a new era of human progress in our own country and in the world. He also said, we have new capacities. We have strength, and we use it to good avail. And his wife, Lady Bird, was with him always during his Texas entertaining. Which brings us to the present and tonight in Washington and what it means. And for that, here is Edward P. Morgan in Washington.
Jet Air Force One that carried President Kennedy on so many of his journeys, which brought President Johnson and President Kennedy's body home to Washington tonight. After a brief statement to the nation at Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland, the new President Johnson shook hands with many congressional leaders, administration officials, and diplomats who had gathered at the airport. Then he boarded the Army helicopter for the 15-minute ride to the Rose Garden on the White House lawn. The burdens of his new office, needless to say, were with him on the way, but he was driving already. Aboard the helicopter with him were Defense Secretary McNamara and White House aide McGeorge Bundy, a specialist in international security affairs for President Kennedy. He undoubtedly briefed the president on urgent foreign policy and national security affairs, with which he has been conversant throughout his reign as vice president anyway. Landing in the White House Rose Garden, Johnson went to his office in the Executive Office Building, a sort of an extenuation of the White House, just a few yards west of the actual White House building. This is Mrs. Johnson coming off the helicopter now. And the President. The President did not go actually into an office so recently vacated by John F. Kennedy in the White House itself, but to that third office that John Secondary mentioned a moment ago, the one in the Executive Office Building. And here he asked for and received pledges of bipartisan support and cooperation from the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Congress, where he himself had served so long and well, both in the House and in the Senate. Now he has a new and unexpected role. The President had other duties tonight. He spoke on the telephone with former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, made a date for President Eisenhower to meet him in the White House tomorrow morning at 11:30. Earlier, Secretary Dean Rusk, turning back from a mission to Japan, will see President Johnson at 9:30. President Johnson, before going home to his mansion in Spring Valley in northwest Washington, which used to be the home of the hostess with the mostest, Pearl Mesta. Before he did that, he also discussed funeral arrangements for the president with Sergeant Shriver, the president's brother-in-law, who is in the White House taking care of these and other family arrangements. And the president talked with J. Edgar Hoover about the search for the assassin. He also put in a phone call to Dallas and got a report from the doctor attending Governor John Connally of Texas, who reported that the governor was in a satisfactory condition. Somebody today said that Lyndon Baines Johnson was a liberal in intellect, a conservative by geography. Certainly the Southern label stuck so hard on him in 1960 that it was, with the Northern liberals, a handicap. Indeed, a group of Negro leaders at the Democratic Convention, when they heard the news that Johnson and his leader, Kennedy, the candidate for president, were going to see them, threatened to leave the room. They were prevailed upon to stay, and after the presidential nominee made a few remarks, Johnson talked for 10 minutes and said, "Gentlemen, I know what you think my label is, but I want to tell you that we are going to make more progress in civil rights in 4 years than we've made in the last 100, and come back in 4 years and see if I am not correct." They will come now in less time than that. As a matter of fact, one of the leaders of the NAACP told this reporter after the Birmingham crisis last spring that he had been astounded at the pace and the commitment that Johnson had made for civil rights. There is little doubt that as president, Lyndon Johnson will embrace fully the main program of the Kennedy New Frontier, particularly civil rights, and a tax cut. The majority leader is back, somebody said today, with sorrow but with realism. They were talking about Lyndon Johnson, the man who once was called a wheeler and dealer as majority leader of the Senate, who will now lead the Senate and the House, if you please, as president from the White House. He understood, perhaps, the creature of Congress better than John F. Kennedy did. And by that understanding, he may, ironically and paradoxically enough, be able to make Congress move faster on the program that John F. Kennedy himself was trying to push. He will do it under a plea for unity and help. This can be powerful at first. And the hunch of this reporter at least, is that he will keep all of the top executive leaders in the administration, particularly Secretary Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara. There has been a certain coolness between him and Attorney General Kennedy, but that is a minor aspect at this point. He may get a 2 or 3 month honeymoon, but then will come the terrible strain of '64. A rifle shot in Dallas this afternoon changed the whole presidential campaign picture on both sides. Secondary reported that the president had a massive heart attack in July '55. What has he done to protect himself? He has quit smoking. Somebody asked Lady Bird Johnson, if he doesn't protect himself more than that, who does? And she said, God, I guess. This is Edward P. Morgan in Washington.
This has been an ABC News special on the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Administration officials indicated that it would be a couple of hours after midnight before the late president's body arrives at the executive mansion. An honor guard of soldiers, sailors, and Marines will line the White House drive when the body is brought through the northwest gate there. The hearse will go to the north portico. Another part of the honor guard will line the White House steps, the lobby, and the hallway to the east room. In that room, which is the biggest one in the White House, an honor guard will be posted throughout the night, and 2 priests will kneel at stations adjacent to the bier on which the president's body rests, and they'll pray throughout this night. Pope Paul VI prayed tonight that the sacrifice of John Kennedy may advance the cause that he promoted and defended for the freedom of peoples and the peace of the world. The pontiff said that he would offer Mass tomorrow for the peace of the president's soul, for the comfort of those who mourn his death, and that love and not hatred shall reign among humanity. Now this report from ABC's correspondent Ron Cochran.
Well, as the hours wear away, it is still, of course, almost impossible to believe that our youngest president is dead. Lyndon Johnson, who saw President Kennedy cut down by an assassin's bullet, is now the 36th president of the United States. Shock, disbelief, and sorrow has swept the world. Condolences to the widow and to the nation have been received from world leaders. In Texas, one of the grimmest manhunts in history is underway to find the sniper who hid out in a building and picked off the president as he drove in an open car on his way to make a speech in Dallas today. Police have arrested a man in Dallas in connection with the assassination. The arrest followed a shooting in which a policeman was killed. The suspect is 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. who worked in the building from which the fatal bullets were fired. It is known that the bullets were fired from that building because the rifle was found there and spent shells. Dallas police say it's been established that Oswald was in the building at the time. Funeral arrangements have been almost completed as our 36th president, Lyndon Johnson, takes command. ABC's White House correspondent Bill Lawrence has developments in Washington. About bringing in our report from the White House with Bill Lawrence. The shock of President Kennedy.
Carrying it will enter through the northwest gate, and the driveway to the north portico will be lined with men from all of the military services, paying a last tribute to their dead commander-in-chief. The dimly lighted White House is empty tonight, except for servants. Mrs. Kennedy is remaining at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where she went with the body of her husband after it was returned from Dallas, Texas, late yesterday afternoon. The children, Carolyn and John F. Jr., both on the verge of birth anniversaries, are in seclusion, and we do not know yet if they have been told of their father's death. President Lyndon B. Johnson worked his first few hours as President of the United States in the vice presidential suite he had occupied across the street in the Executive Office building. Then he went to his Spring Valley home, but he will be back early tomorrow morning to confer with Secretary of State Rusk, who with other cabinet members was headed for Japan when the president was shot in Dallas. Only the family and a few of the nation's highest officials, including former President Eisenhower, will pay a final tribute to the slain President Kennedy at the White House on Saturday. But on Sunday, a cortege will move up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, where the body will lie in state, and members of the public will be allowed to pay their tribute. The funeral is set for noon Monday at St. Matthew's Cathedral, with Cardinal Cushing celebrating a pontifical requiem mass. Burial plans are unannounced, but the assumption is that John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 36th President of the United States, will be placed beside the body of his infant son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, in the Kennedy family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, a Boston suburb. This is Bill Lawrence at the White House.